Hi everyone, I'm Joss. I'm a social worker in New Brunswick and I make videos on addiction and mental health. Today we're going to talk about gambling. Gambling is the only non-substance related addiction that found its way in the DSM-5. It's the first behavior addiction. This opens the door for future behavior to make their way into the addiction section of the DSM. The DSM is pretty much the Bible for psychiatrists. It's where you find the official definition of all the different mental illness and disorders. Gambling is like many other addiction. It has three core components. First of all, there's the phenomena that certain tolerance seems to occur. Secondly, people who quit gambling often experience withdrawal symptoms. And finally, they're unable to quit. If we look at tolerance, what it means is really that over time, a certain amount of a thing starts to not feel as good. So what I mean by that, with the case of alcohol, if you think that, taking a shot late at night, you know what, it helps me relax, helps me to put me to bed. If you take that same one shot every night for the next month, at the end of a month, that shot really does not have the same impact on you because you've developed tolerance. You're now tougher to the substance, more resistant, if you will. That happens with people who gamble too. Obviously, they're not taking in a substance, but like you can think of it in terms of amounts, whether it be an amount of money played or an amount of like a duration of time. So if they kind of scratch their itch with 1 hour of playtime before, over time, maybe it turns into 2 hours, maybe it turns into a 5 hour day, something like that. If we talk about withdrawal symptoms for people who gamble, there's like the two categories, like with any other addiction. There's psychological symptoms and there's physical symptoms. So, in terms of psychological symptoms, what we can see is that people who discontinue gambling after they've had the disorder for a long time, they can feel depression, quite intense depression, in fact. Anxiety can be through the roof. Insomnia problems are very common. And one thing that you can count on is like cravings for the behavior. So all these would qualify as more psychological withdrawals. The physical symptoms of gambling withdrawal, what you can see are symptoms very similar to anxiety. You see increased heart rate, you see sweating, you see shaking, tremors, difficulty kind of holding food down. So um, all stress related type of physical problems. The last symptom that we see that's related to all the other addiction is the inability to quit, right? You're aware of the problems that it causes in your life, but yet you're unable to discontinue the behavior. Mistake that people make when they go gamble is that they really think that it's them against a machine, right? It's them against the game when it's truly not the case. If we look at the science they use to develop all the different gambling games, what you see is that it's very difficult to become resistant because they use psychology that's 100 years old to try to trick us to play at a machine, even just if it's for a minute longer. So a lot of those research rely on studies done by Pavlov. He was in the late 1800s or 1900s. He was in the late 1890. No, he was in the late 1900s, and he studied animals, dogs specifically. um, and he did some studies that related to like saliva produced by dogs. He realized that one morning when he went to look at the saliva tubes, they were already filled up. He had not even introduced the steak to the dogs, so he thought, what the hell? They heard my footstep and they started to drool. Dogs drool for steak. Dogs do not drool for footsteps. He took it a step further. He said, well, what if I tried to like train them, condition them? So he started to use a bell. So he'd ring a bell, then he'd give a piece of steak. He'd ring a bell, he'd give a piece of steak. And he would do that over and over until one day he rang a bell and he didn't give the steak. But yet the dogs were already drooling. He didn't stop there. He continued his research because like he trained them, he wanted to see if he could untrain them. And obviously, like that's a simple recipe. You ring the bell and you don't give the steak, and you do that enough times, and the dogs are going to learn that the bell doesn't equate steak, and it's going to stop drooling at the sound of a bell. He pushed it even further. What he did is he wanted to see what would be the best strategy to get the dogs to drool at the sound of a bell longer after he stopped feeding them. And what he realized is that the best way to achieve that is to give the dog steak only once in a while under a variable rate, right? So the dog hears the bell, but he doesn't know if he's gonna get the steak or not. Kind of that like randomness. That's where we start to discuss the idea of his research being used to uh, the application of gambling machines, because gambling machines are like random. They are random, and the rate at which they pay out is very much variable. You know, they don't pay at every 10 spin, they don't pay at every 15 spin. It's random. So what happens when it's random is that even after you don't give the stake, after you don't get the reward, you continue to repeat the behavior for the longest period of time. And it brings us to, the new types of addiction that we're about to see come into the DSM-5, which are the telephone or internet or apps addiction, right? You think of an app. What is it that you do? What you do is that you scroll down and eventually you see something that's you like, something that's rewarding. Boom. And it gives you a little jolt and you're happy and it was worth your while, right? I wasted 2 minutes scrolling, but then boom, I see something that's good. And what it does is that it encourages us to keep scrolling for another 2 minutes. Maybe I'll see something nice. But you never know if it's in 2 minutes or if it's the next scroll that you're going to see something good. And that's where the similarity with gambling continues, right? You never know when the next big payout is going to be. What I think is dangerous is that even if we're quite aware that we don't let our kids go play VLT machines at dualies, we often, unfortunately, give them access to phones, right? Maybe not at 2 years old, but eventually, before they're 18, they're probably going to get their hands on a phone. They'll have Facebook or so TikTok or Instagram or whatever they're up to now, but they will have something. And that process of training yourself to kind of keep scrolling to see if you're not going to come across something good, that kind of lays a foundation, in our mind that it could be dangerous. It could be training us to have problems with gambling later. Not only that, with the apps now, with the online gambling, I mean, people have access to destroy their whole paycheck anywhere that they're at. Nowadays, you have access to that 24/7. It increases the temptation, it makes it more private. If we think of the treatment options for people with gambling disorders, what I find is that they're not really tailored to people with gambling disorders. Often, unfortunately, they have to be placed in groups with um, general addiction groups. And so it doesn't really talk directly to them. And it also ostracize them in a sense where often people with substance use addiction, they don't relate or they really don't get how somebody with a gambling addiction is the same thing, because again, the person with a gambling disorder is not introducing a substance into their body. Gambling is legal anywhere in Canada, right? It's the government that's making a buck from people engaging in gambling, right? The government regulates anything related to gambling. But in a sense, the government is dependent on gambling, on gambling revenues to finance all its other little projects. I think it's fair to say it's morally ambiguous at best. All the government really has to do is to fund a few positions in mental health centers here and there, maybe a couple commercials on TV, and it washes its ends of all the troubles brought on by gambling. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Hope this was interesting. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment. Let me know if there's any topic you guys would like to hear me talk about. All right, take care.